I'm going to make a short statement and then I'll take your questions. The COVID-19 lockdowns fell like a hammer blow on small businesses. To the Victorian Government's credit, it swiftly announced an economic survival package to provide $10,000 grants to eligible small business owners. This was the economic lifeline tens of thousands of people were waiting for. The fund was established and scaled at speed. But soon after, my office was inundated with complaints. I received more than 1,100 complaints about the fund. There was desperation in people's voices. They were counting on a grant to pay wages, rent, bills, to survive. Good intentions got lost in translation. People who were genuinely eligible for a grant were refused because they made a simple mistake, or were confused by what was indeed a confusing process. The department had 9 days to implement the program, but it missed some of the key checks and balances that would have picked up the inevitable flaws. The aim of the fund was laudable: to support a hugely vulnerable cohort affected by the lockdown. But administering it inflexibly undermined its very purpose. The people were forgotten in the process. Many complaints could have been resolved without coming to my office had the department been more reasonable at the time. To the department's credit, it engaged constructively with my office from the outset, resolving large numbers of complaints and improving their processes along the way. Many people received their grants while the investigation was ongoing. And now, as a result of my investigation, about 12,000 small business owners may be able to reapply to the fund. That's potentially over $100 million going back into the small business community. Sometimes it takes the nudge of the Ombudsman's elbow to encourage public servants to do the right thing. In the end, that they do the right thing is what matters. Thank you, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Ombudsman, do you think there was a genuine attempt to try and give out as fewer grants as they could get away with, or not?
I think, to the department's credit, they did actually give out tens of thousands of grants to small business owners. And they did have very short time to set this up. So I don't think that. I think what comes through here is that lack of compassion, the lack of discretion that you need to be able to apply in circumstances like this.
What caused that? Is it because they outsourced a lot of the call centre work and they didn't have access to the data, or is it just people treating each other like numbers rather than people?
I think that, and I have to say, I have seen this many times in my role. Not only in my current role, I have seen that dealing with complaints in the UK, in other departments. So this is that computer says no mindset, where it's easier to say no than to exercise discretion and do the right thing.
What about the people whose businesses had to close because of this? This grant could have helped them. Where are they now? Is it too late for them?
Well, what I very much hope is that all those, the recommendation the department has accepted means that about 12,000 people will be able to reapply to the fund. So fundamentally, the point here is the government set eligibility criteria, and they didn't change. The recommendation means that those who genuinely meet those criteria should be able to get the grant. So it deals with those people who made a typo in a form or whose applications were, it remained in draft unbeknown to the applicants, who were refused on the basis of what amounted to a simple mistake.
But if their business is now folded and it's happened already, is it too late to get that grant for that business? Can they get it for another business?
Well, it does relate specifically to that tranche of the fund. I obviously can't comment on individual circumstances, but it means that people should be put back into the position they should have been in at the time. And there is a bit of a better late than never about this, but I think each case does need to be considered on its merits.
What do you think about the department's response to your investigation?
They were very constructive in dealing with us, and quite a large number of complaints were resolved along the way. It did take the final draft of the report to encourage the more fulsome response that we now see. But as I say, sometimes it takes the nudge of the Ombudsman's elbow. The important thing for me is that they have now done the right thing.
Because you did ask for some cases to be reviewed, didn't you, and that didn't happen?
Yes, I mean there were a number that were resolved along the way. There were some that we were unable to resolve that should now be resolved.
Are you aware of any businesses that folded because of their inability to access these grants?
Not directly. I mean, what you see in the report is certainly and there may well have been, but I don't know. But what comes through in the cases that we describe in the report really is the desperation people were feeling. I mean, I have no doubt, that this was an enormous struggle, and I can't say with all of them what has happened. Many did receive their grants, and I hope now if they're genuinely eligible, they should be doing so now.
And how can departments guard against this type of mentality and problem in the future for programs that have to be scaled up very quickly and with little notice?
Well, there are a number of really basic checks and balances that need to go into an executive grant program, and again, these are not new, and the report sets out quite a few things that should happen in future. But broadly, we're talking about it needs to have a good complaint process, a good internal review process, because when you do something at speed, inevitably mistakes are going to be made, and what internal review will do and what complaints process will do is identify those pressure points quickly, so that you can rectify them before it's too late.
How did you come to this number of 12,000 businesses? Forgive me if it's in the report.
Oh, the department told us those those are their numbers, not ours.
Right. And are they the number of businesses that were rejected?
Well, they would all have been rejected. They fell into a number of criteria.
Right.
So, for example, applications that remained in draft. So these are all applications that were refused for a number of reasons. The particular criteria are set out in the report. I think you'll find it in the recommendation section.
The call centre initially had 5 staff members.
Yes.
That later swelled, but that initial 5 people, was that number shocking?
Well, it's a significant underestimation of the demand, to put it mildly. But one of the key issues with the call centre that was troubling, and again, these are lessons that the department needed to learn and has learnt, is that there's no point in having a call centre, even if it's staffed with hundreds of people, if they don't have the information needed to answer people's questions. And they didn't have that information. So some of the frustration that people were expressing to us was, I kept ringing the call centre and they had no access to their specific applications, so all they could do was provide generalities.
And even in their response, though, they said they don't think it's right, that they should have had access to that information.
Well, I think we had to disagree about their interpretation of privacy considerations. The recommendation really is, if you're going to do this again, and no doubt in other circumstances will arise where it is done again, ensure that your call centre either has the information at their fingertips or can convey it to somebody who can answer the question, because otherwise there's just no point in having one.
What do you think about people who were eligible for this money being denied at a time when they really needed it?
a lack of compassion, I think a lack of humanity, I think a lack of recognition of the stress and anxiety that people were going through during these lockdowns.
And difficult for people who are already under an enormous amount of stress to have to apply to you, to write to you about getting this grant which they were entitled to.
Yes, and I think the department now acknowledges it. Everybody made mistakes. Everybody was operating under enormous stress last year. I include the department in that. But all the more reason when you do something at speed, as they were obliged to do, to have those checks and balances in place that will tell you when things are going wrong.
Is the funding shortfall that you've spoken about in recent months, that's still an issue then? Did that have an impact on this investigation at all?
Are you talking about my well, as you can see by this not insubstantial report, I've made it very clear that I will do my job, and I'm doing my job. Any other questions?
Do you feel you're being adequately resourced at the moment? Given we've got the budget coming up in a few weeks' time.
You can ask me that question after the, I've, as is well known, and I have said very publicly, I've made a bid to the current budget process, and I await that outcome. We can have this conversation perhaps after the state budget.